So here we go, my 10 things I wish I'd known when I started sewing. Number 1, always use a hoop. A hoop is the most essential item in your sewing box. It means that you maintain the tension as you stitch, so you don't end up, like I did here, with creases in your finished piece that you can't get out after. It means when you stitch, you'll always be able to get the creases out at the end. But also it makes it so much easier to stitch. It makes it easier if you place your needle on the back. It makes it easier if you do neat stitches. Doing French knots without a hoop is an impossibility. So if you're stitching without a hoop still, get on board. You need a hoop. Number 2, don't feel like you have to have a hoop that's big enough to fit your entire design in. I started like that, trying to get these massive sizes of hoops, and there's no tension in the middle of them. They are a nightmare. So I personally stitch everything with a 5-inch or a 6-inch hoop. All you do as you stitch with your little hoop is you move it around the design. So you move it here, and you stitch, 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 stitch. Move it down. Stitch, stitch, stitch. You do not need a big hoop for a big piece. A little hoop for every piece is perfect. Number 3, choose a needle size that works for you. Don't think because you're doing embroidery that you have to use an embroidery needle. I use, for all my embroidery, chenille needles. Chenille needles have a much bigger eye, and I don't know about you, but I don't want to spend my evenings struggling to thread a needle. So I use a chenille needle, size 22 for everything, apart from French knots. French knots can be a bit of a nightmare, so use a smaller needle to get a neat French knot. But that is the only situation in which I use a small needle, and that is a size 5 embroidery needle, for those who want to know the details. Number 4, find yourself an easy way to split thread. As you start embroidering, you'll find that you spend a lot of your time splitting threads. And I see people doing all sorts of crazy methods of putting it between their legs and pulling it apart, but so often getting in a tangle. So find yourself a method that works for you. I'll show you mine. I just grab it all between my thumb and forefinger, and I pull out 1 strand at a time. Never 2, because if I pull 2 strands out, inevitably that gets into a knot. So even if you think you're going to save time, you're really not. Number 5, do not make sewing an acrobatic exercise. The number of workshops where I see people cutting incredibly long strands of thread, mainly probably to avoid doing too many times splitting, but really long strands of thread are pretty antisocial to stitch with in public, inevitably get in knots, and altogether make the process a little bit more unpleasant. So you think you're going to save time by cutting longer strands of thread? Don't bother. I always work with an arm's length of the thread, and it's honestly the most comfortable stitching length to use. So don't go mad. Number 6, opposite end of the spectrum, don't be too parsimonious with your thread. When you get towards the end of a length, always stop before you think you need to. Inevitably, you'll find yourself pushing it, thinking I can get 1 more stitch out of this amount of thread, and then you'll spend the next 5 minutes on the back trying to find a way to knot off your thread. When you've only got a tiny amount, your needle will be unthreaded 100 times in the process, and you'll wish you had just left yourself a little more thread. Number 7, gold thread is the worst thing to stitch with. Don't worry, there's nothing wrong with you. There is something wrong with this guy. But sadly, it's very lovely in finished pieces. So if you find yourself struggling with gold thread, find yourself workarounds. 3 ways to work around bad gold thread. Number 1, stitch with shorter pieces. Gold thread frays really easily, and the longer the pieces, the more frayed it gets, therefore the more it knots, therefore the more difficult it gets to work with. Number 2, as you stitch, regularly trim off the end, because that's where it'll all start to get a bit tangled. So I trim a little bit as I go, just to keep it fresh and keep it smooth. But the best tip, number 3, find yourself a similar colour of thread. Cut yourself the same length as your gold And say you're intending to stitch with 4 strands. Instead of stitching with 4 strands of gold, match together 3 strands of gold with 1 strand of your yellow. Just adding 1 normal strand of thread in amongst it makes such a massive difference. You find that the thread just doesn't fray or tangle in the way it normally would, and you will not notice the difference in the finished piece. So if you're working with gold, get yourself a companion colour. Right needle, length of thread. I've lost track, so we're going to go with this being number 7. Number 7, don't unpick anything. This is my 101-year-old granny's mantra for sewing. She lives by the idea you do not unpick. Now, obviously, every so often there is a scenario where you can't stitch over the bit where you've gone wrong, or if you're particularly precious about something, or you've written something and you've got a spelling mistake in it, you do have to unpick. But if you're going to unpick, don't try reverse the stitches. The number of times I see someone try to stitch back into that hole, it rarely works, and more often than not, then you just end up with a bigger knot. So take your needle off the thread and then use the reverse side of the needle, the eye of the needle, to pull through the thread. Number 8, beware of very light fabrics. Beautiful pieces to stitch on, but they show everything once you finish stitching. You'll see all the trailing threads, you'll see all your knots. So as you stitch, if you're going to be working on light fabric, you have to be neat on the back. And I'm not a neat stitcher. You know, I have no intention of being neat on the back of my pieces, but I do think if you're stitching on something pale, be neat. Number 9, take time to mount up your piece properly. It breaks my heart to see a beautifully embroidered piece that's then stuck in a frame, loose, not mounted up. The moment you've got creases, the moment you don't stretch it, you just don't see the beauty of the stitching you've done. But if you do mount it, when you pull all those creases out, all the stitches pop forward, more 3D, and the whole piece just looks so much more professional. Then that takes me on to number 10, frame your embroidery. You create something beautiful, frame it. Don't display it on the wall in a hoop. Don't leave it in your sewing bag. Make it a piece of art. What you have made is a piece of art, and how much better do pieces look when they are presented in a frame that celebrates the design you stitched. So take the time, mount your piece, frame it, and hang it on your wall and make it something to be proud of. So there we go. My top 10, or maybe I snuck an 11th in there, who knows? My top things that I wish I'd known when I started sewing.